I'm afraid he's gotten a ringer in Haven Kimmel Holmes.
So yes, I am here to introduce you, Max.
Uh-oh.
And you know, he was very specific about how I should make sure that my name wasn't there, that it should just say introducer of Max Carter. And at first I thought, okay, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. And then I figured it out and I was so proud. And then I signed on and didn't realize that my picture was still there, and, which I was afraid you might recognize. So then I had to leave the meeting and come back to the meeting. But surprise, hi.
Well, hello.
So he asked me to introduce you, but he didn't tell me what he meant by that. And I wasn't sure if I was supposed to give a factual introduction about you or and does this happen every week?
Phil has rung in some people to do this. The less said about me, probably the better.
And how did the other people go about it?
Well, they usually wore a sack over their heads so that no one could recognize them as someone who knew me. But basically, they just said how they knew me and handed it off.
Good. Okay.
And well, usually they would try to include one very embarrassing story.
Oh, that's a tough one because all of the embarrassing stories probably are about me and not Max. Somehow he maintains dignity, and I'm not sure how. Well, here is how I know Max. I like to say that Max and I are twins that grew up in different families many years apart, and which is a scientific marvel, but entirely possible if you know Indiana. So Max grew up in Rocheville on a farm, and I grew up in Moreland on a farm. And though his parents meant to have him, and my parents left me at the farm with the farm people. So mine was by accident. And then we both, so Rocheville, Indiana, Moreland, Indiana. Then we both went to Ball State for our undergraduate degrees. We still didn't know each other. Then we both went to the Earlham School of Religion for seminary. We still didn't know each other. Then we both moved to North Carolina afterward, didn't know each other. And then we both became members of North Carolina Yearly Meeting. And finally, at some point, we crossed, I don't remember the first time we crossed paths, Max. Was it? Invited
you down to Guilford to give a talk.
Right. So that's when we met. And it's amazing to me. Scott has seen this he's seen it in action, but it's odd to have someone who has that much in common with you, because if those are the facts of the case, because they're odd things to have in common when you look at the rest of the United States. So for instance, I can say to Max, it was that particular kind of cold when you have to milk the cows at 5 in the morning in the winter. And he will know exactly what I mean. That is not the same kind of cold as any other kind of cold. And I could say something about Ball State, and he knows exactly the culture of Ball State. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. When and this is true of Philip Gully too, when I posted on Facebook how, I've lost many people in my life, as we all have at this age, but one I have never gotten over is Tom Mullen. And I thought I might never. And here come Max and Phil, and knew exactly what I meant. They knew how we will never see the likes of him again. So for me, Max is just a soulmate. He's my favorite Quaker historian and Quaker scholar, and he's my favorite Hoosier. And so I'm thrilled to be able to introduce him tonight, and you're very lucky to be taking class from him.
Gosh, well, thanks, Haven. Your favorite Hoosier this time of year ought to be James Whitcomb Riley. I was quoting him when we had our first frost yesterday.
Because of the pumpkin on the vine?
When the frost is on the pumpkin and the fog is in the shot. But thank you, Haven. And for those of you who don't know Haven Kimmel Holmes, read A Girl Named Zippy. It's about her growing up in Moreland and her subsequent books. She got up off the couch, I think something Light and Rising. I mean, there are several books that Haven has written. under the tutelage, at least the first one, of Tom Mullen,
That's
who
right.
helped
Mhm.
form that piece of paper, that memoir at ESR, into that New York Times best-selling book.
Yeah, he was
So,
he was a hero. And the in fact, all of I have 8 books in print and 3 unpublished, and they all take place in the same, postage stamp of native soil in East Central Indiana. And when I was asked about that in an interview, I said, well, it was up for grabs. Nobody was covering it. And I thought that's what I was sent here for, so that the world would have to read an infinite number of books about East Central Indiana.
oh, great. Well,
That was what was given to me. So that was what I did. And that part has been very interesting, because the one thing that my editor, the person who acquired Zippy and then edited all the books, first at Random House and then at Simon & Schuster, one thing that she understood was that the world is much larger than the coasts in America. And there really was this untapped market for, the Midwest and farm country.
Yeah.
And when Zippy came out, she was entirely right. And going into my writing career, that was exactly what my goal was to make sure that people, and not, certainly not just the part of the Midwest I was from, but all the places in America where people believe that they're represented by no one, and no one understands them. So
yeah.
thank you, Max, for the recommendation.
Well, thank you. And again, everyone read A Girl Named Zippy. You will get some insight, honest to goodness, in some of the issues we'll be talking about tonight. The 20th century separations, the development and assimilation of Quakerism into a Protestant mainstream, and the decline then of Quakerism in Indiana. So, Haven, thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. And best of luck, and have a wonderful rest of this series and class tonight. And give my best to Phil. Tell him I missed him.
And say hi to Scott and Gus. And
I shall.
All righty. And get back to Popeyes.
Okay. Right.
Could I ask, when did Tom Mullen pass?
Well,
10
say the
years
question.
ago, 12 years ago, about.
Oh, yeah, I think it was 8 years ago.
8.
Oh,
yeah.
my.
Yeah.
74, 75. Yeah. What a loss. What an amazing person. Amazing person.
Yeah. I tried to explain, Scott and I were in Indiana a week ago, and at Earlham to watch our son Caleb play soccer for his last home game. He's a senior, and it was his last home game. And we went to visit ESR, and it was bittersweet, well, just sweet, but poignant and tender. And I when we left, I said, I dearly loved everyone there, the whole faculty, the staff, everyone. And but I could just hear Tom in the, while I was there. And I said, it's hard to describe why his loss is so immeasurable for those of us who knew him, but he was just the best at everything.
Yeah. And able to be side-splitting, funny, and profound at the same time.
That's right.
There are as many stories about Tom Mullen as there are about Elton Trueblood, and we will get around to tonight's topic soon, but I got to tell this one joke that Tom Mullen would tell. He was a master of puns. He taught Introduction to Bible at Earlham, which students referred to as Baby Bible. And every Friday before he sent the students off for the weekend, he would give them a sustaining thought for the weekend. And it was always some funny, punny sort of a thing. And the one I remember was sending them off for the weekend. He said, now, if you get depressed over the weekend, have hope. Remember, Jonah was down in the mouth for 3 days and he came out all right.
He also used to say he was so good to his core, and he was so honorable, and his marriage to Nancy was as there's a whole book of A Very Good Marriage, a memoir, he wrote after her death. And he was very, very married. And so he would, at the end of sermon writing class, he would often say, goodbye, goodbye, children, go and sin freely, as we walked out of class. And once I was interviewing him for something, and I said, well, Tom, you talk about your health a lot. So if you were told that you only had 24 hours left to live, how would you want to die? And he said, I would like to be shot while running out of the bedroom of another man's wife. It was so untrue and so unexpected. I actually did a spit take, like in a movie. He knew exactly the moment to say the thing you would never expect him to say. This buttoned up, theologian. He was so wonderful. He was so dear. I'll miss him forever. And so I'll Max, when I post the pictures from ESR, I'll tag you on Facebook.
Great, thank you. And
Take
thanks
care.
again, Haven. And
My pleasure.
have a
Bye-bye.
great evening. Well, thank you. And read all of Haven's books and all of Tom Mullen's books. You'll enjoy them all. Okay, so this evening, as we wrap up this series, we're going to look at how we got here from there, the state of not only Indiana Quakerism, American Quakerism, but also worldwide Quakerism. So all of that in what's now less than an hour and a half. I do this with a great deal of fear and trembling because the previous 4 sessions, we've been talking about ancient history that none of us lived through. Tonight, we're talking about issues that many of us have not only lived through, but some of us have had some significant roles in. And we'll get around to some of that towards the end of this evening, the especially recent events in Western Yearly Meeting, Indiana Yearly Meeting, and here in North Carolina Yearly Meeting. But to start off, I want to go back to last week and the separations of the 1800s, because that laid the groundwork for many of the issues that have vexed Quakers in this century and the last. But I didn't get around to talking about some of the other separations that have also laid some of that groundwork. I was reminded of this by one of you who emailed me and said, what about the Progressive Friends? And if you got a copy of the Quaker family tree, you saw that there was a little twig that went off the Hicksite branch called Progressive Friends. The Progressive Friends were very important because they were Hicksites in the mid 1800s who found the Hicksites far too conservative, and they sought more engagement in social issues of the time, women's suffrage, abolitionism, and so on. Some very important Hicksite Progressive Friends, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and they helped articulate a progressive Quakerism that had a profound impact on 20th century Quakerism of the liberal Friends General Conference sort. So the Progressive Friends are important to understand. They're very small, but quite influential. We talked about the Conservative Friends, those who sought to conserve the old practices of Quakerism. And Lee Edmondson sent me a lovely picture of that conservative meeting house on South Street in Plainfield that Phil mentioned last week, and I appreciate that. Thanks, Lee. There in Indiana, you also probably are aware of Central Yearly Meeting, which developed out of a split in Westfield Friends Meeting there north of Indianapolis in the 1920s, deeply influenced by the holiness movement. I don't know if they still have their academy up there, but up until a few years ago, they still had their own private academy at Westfield. And then another separation, well, not so much a separation, but a development among Friends in the late 1800s called the Beanite Quakers. They're important because they are liberal, but independent. They don't belong to Friends General Conference or Conservative or FUM or EFI, but they go back to Joel and Hannah Bean in Iowa, who were evangelical Gurneyite Quakers, who'd been missionaries to Hawaii, but were conservative in that they valued the old expectant waiting form of Quaker worship. And in the 1870s and 80s, when the holiness revivals swept through Iowa, and we'll talk about those revivals soon, they said, okay, that's fine for some of you, but we prefer the old style of silent, expectant waiting without hymns and prepared sermons. And that so threatened the revival preachers and the holiness preachers that they hounded them out of Iowa. And they left for the area of San Francisco just to get away from the controversy. And they didn't want to, muddy the water. So we'll just leave. And they hounded them all the way out to California, demanding that the meeting, I think it was I forget the name of the meeting that they founded out there, but these revival preachers insisted that that meeting disowned them for not accepting the holiness theology and the new measures in Quakerism. And the meeting said, no, we love them. We're not going to do that. Go away, go back to Iowa. And they, from that experience, developed an association of friends that was independent of all other Quaker branches, so that no one else is going to tell them what to do. And the Beanite branch of Friends is still around. North Pacific yearly meeting is a Beanite yearly meeting. And they're largely out there in the Northwest in California. But that is also an important understanding from the 1800s of that, how deep the animosity was by some of these revival preachers to the old style of Quakerism. Now, again, these separations and splits of the 1800s occurred only here in the United States. They did not occur elsewhere. They didn't occur in England, except for one meeting, the Fritchley meeting, sided with the Wilburites. They were known as the Fritchley Remnant. But they eventually rejoined London yearly meeting. So there was no separation in London yearly meeting in England. In part, this is because England's small and everyone knew each other. And the United States is very big, and Quakers had spread out across this enormous continent and were mixing and mingling out on the frontier with Methodists and Baptists and so on. So it's a very different cultural, societal issue here in the United States. So this was pretty unique to the United States. So that's in the background. But what has really set the stage for the difficulties and separations and splits of the 21st century that we'll get around to soon were really the two movements in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The first was those revival movements. Now, the revivals came in after the Civil War for a variety of reasons. One, as a calamitous experience like the Civil War, where more people died in the Civil War than I think all the other American wars combined. It was a devastating experience. And at times like that, people are sometimes looking for Jesus to return. This seems like one of those apocalyptic moments when soon the clouds may part and end of the world. You become quite interested in where you're going to spend eternity. There are also a lot of revivals that broke out around the campfires in those Union and Confederate Army camps, because these young men, might meet their maker the next day in battle, and they were deeply concerned about their spiritual life. So there was a lot of revival going on spiritually in those army camps. And for a variety of reasons, then after the Civil War, a lot of these revivals started taking place. And some of it was influenced by the Third Great Awakening. We talked about the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening last week. The Third Great Awakening was in the 1850s, sometimes known as the businessman's revival. Moody Bible Institute came out of that. And this again was an intense revival of evangelical understanding of the need for salvation, the need for forgiveness of sins and sanctification through the substitutionary atonement of Christ and the authority of the Bible. And that was major in the mid 1800s. And Quakers were no longer isolated as much as they used to be. They had access to national publications, the telegraph, and so much of this was publicized. People had access to reading about the revivals. And it's also important to understand the role of the young people among friends, because after 150 years of quietism, of deep, silent meetings where sometimes you'd gone for half a year without anyone speaking, no vocal prayer, no music, no excitement. When a revival came to town, this was like the circus coming to town. And the young people, young Quakers, flocked to them. Here in North Carolina, this was the case in 1870 when Alan Jay, that Indiana Quaker from south of Lafayette, had come down here to rebuild the Southern Quaker community after the Civil War. He had put a lot of effort into raising funds to rebuild the Southern Quaker community, to rebuild meeting houses, get the boarding school back on a firm foundation, bringing in literary societies and a model farm, and so much more to rebuild the Quaker community. But in 1870, the Methodists brought revivals to Trinity, North Carolina, which is just inside Randolph County from Guilford County. Trinity is actually where Duke University started, as Trinity College. And in 1870, they set up their revivals, and the young Quakers headed off in droves because it was exciting. And Alan Jay realized that if we lose that generation of young friends, there won't be a future for Quakers in North Carolina. And the elders, even the parents of these young people, were saying, you can't do that. Quakers had a testimony at that time that you didn't go to the preaching services of another denomination. They were out of truth. You don't go off to other worship services. That's not how we do things. And here they were going, and their parents sometimes weren't welcoming them back in their homes. The elders were ready to kick them out of meeting. And Alan Jay said, we got to save these kids for the Friends Church. So he struck a bargain with the elders of the Springfield meeting, where he was a member, that if he would accompany these young people to these revivals, and with their assurance that, okay, we'll stay Quaker, even if we get saved, sanctified, and bound for glory at this revival, Alan Jay could then tell the elders and their parents, okay, I've got their assurances, they'll remain Quakers, but give them some slack. This is meeting a spiritual condition of theirs. And they respected Alan Jay enough, they said, okay, you accompany them with those assurances, and he would report back that, this is having a good effect on these young people. There's spiritual vitality now, and their lives are giving witness to the profound impact of these revivals. And to get some sense of why the young people were attracted to this, if you have ever seen Friendly Persuasion, and I think you're all of an age where you might have, this wonderful Quaker movie starring Dorothy McGuire and who was it? Anyway, it's all about Quakers in Jennings County during the Civil War. Gary Cooper, and Anthony Perkins in his first starring role before he started becoming a slasher in Psycho. There's this one scene in early on in the film where the origins of NASCAR are shown as the Quaker buggy and the Methodist buggy are heading off to their individual places for worship and are trading gray paint. And the Quakers peel off and go to their meeting. The Methodists peel off and go to their church services. And there's this scene where all the Quakers in their plain dress file in and sit down, and silence settles in. And the camera pans around the worship room, this profound silence for about a minute. And then a little boy crawls up into the window and peers across the meadow at the Methodist church across the way. And the camera pans to the Methodist church where there's bright colors and organ playing and people are singing and smiling and having a great time. The camera pans back to the Quakers and it's silence. That gives a sense of the reality of what was attracting these young people, the excitement of these revivals. And that led here in North Carolina and up in Indiana to allowances of these young people to have their own meetings, to have vocal prayer, to speak in meeting even when they weren't recorded as ministers. One of those revivals broke out in the home of Elijah and Rhoda Coffin in Richmond in the 1860s, and had profound impact on Indiana. And here in North Carolina, those revivals spread. Other Quaker meetings said, okay, we'd kind of like to have those at our meetings. And those revivals then started attracting other people out of non-Quaker culture to be saved in these Quaker revivals. A big one over in Indiana, at Walnut Ridge around Carthage, had a huge impact on Indiana. And there was one up in New London, my ancestral home, Honey Creek quarterly meeting, an old plain meeting house that seated about 1,000. And the elders and recorded ministers of that meeting were not going to have a revival. There were some people in the meetings that would like to have a revival here because they were seeing the impact of these revivals elsewhere. And the ministers said, no, we're not going to do that here at New London. But the janitor, who was sympathetic to the revivalists, accidentally left the basement door unlocked one day, and a revival preacher came in, had a rip-roaring revival, and scores of folk were saved in that revival and came into membership in Honey Creek monthly meeting. And within a decade, they were a programmed pastoral Protestant meeting. And this is what happened throughout the South and in the Midwest. As these revivals had their impact and people were saved at these revivals and these Quaker meetings, they sought membership in those meetings. Sometimes it was the only church in the community. And so here in North Carolina, we went from 2,000 Quakers at the end of the Civil War to more than 8,000 during the period of these revivals in 1870s. Almost all of them coming out of non-Quaker culture. So within just a matter of a few years, most of those meetings changed from the old quietist form of Quaker worship to giving up the plain speech, the plain dress, the opposition to music and prepared sermons, and often asked the revival preacher to stay and continue to instruct us and become our settled pastoral paid minister. If you look at Western Yearly Meeting, in 1870, you read the discipline, and you're not supposed to go off to pastoral meetings. You're not supposed to go to the worship services of other Protestants. No music, no prepared sermons. It was the old quietist form. By 1877, all of that was out the window. And as I said last week, the last two conservative, capital C, friends were essentially hooted and hollered out of Western Yearly Meeting House, and they went off and established Western Yearly Meeting Conservative, capital C. So it happened almost overnight. And I put in the chat, one of the best books to read about this is Tom Ham's The Transformation of American Quakerism. And he starts in Westfield with a report of an English Quaker visitor in 1865 describing quietist Quakers. He comes back for a visit 10 years later, and it's like you can't recognize them as Quakers. And in the architectural slideshow that we ended last week with, you could see the evolution of Quaker meeting houses during that period. 1860s, 1870s, you had meeting houses built the old architectural style where they were Gurneyite, Wilburite, or Hicksite. By 1898, you've got Winchester Friends Church with practically gargoyles and towers and stained glass and organs. It was a profound transformation. All of that then brought in not only new measures, but new pastors, from other denominations. Because for one thing, Quakers allowed women preachers. So if you were a Methodist woman interested in revivals and evangelical Christianity, you didn't have a role as a preacher or as a missionary or as a revival preacher in your Methodist or Baptist or Presbyterian denomination. So where could you go? To the Quakers, because they allowed women preachers. And so we got a lot of folk from outside Friends, not only through the revivals that brought in new members from outside Quakers, but pastoral leadership from outside of Friends. And of course, that's going to have a profound impact because already the social boundary markers are falling, the plain speech, plain dress, the various testimonies. Now, the Quaker theology is under siege because they don't understand the stuff about the inward light and the theology of continuing revelation. The Bible is a secondary authority. So that stuff starts coming in as theological changes. So much of this happened that by 1887, the leaders of the Orthodox Gurneyite yearly meetings around the United States said, we've got to have a conference and sort out who we are. We don't even recognize ourselves as a unified Quakerism anymore. So who are we and can we figure out what direction we're going in? So in 1887, there was a conference held at Richmond of the Orthodox Gurneyite yearly meetings to sort out, okay, who are we? And they agreed in that 3-day conference that we will allow music, we will allow prepared sermons, we can have hired ministers, but we're not going to adopt the outward sacraments. We're going to maintain our peace testimony and our other testimonies, but we are going to adopt a more evangelical understanding of the Bible, that the Bible is the authority for our faith and life, and that there can be no appeal from Scripture to any other source for matters of faith and life. Now that becomes key later on in the 20th century when there are all the debates we're going to get around to about homosexuality, New Age theology, same-sex marriage. The Richmond Declaration of Faith's high view of Scripture, that this is the authority to which we refer for all of these questions, becomes a major sticking point, and we'll get around to that. So 1887, the Orthodox Gurneyite yearly meetings adopt the Richmond Declaration of Faith, and it's there in your Western Yearly Meeting, Faith and Practice, if you want to look it up. And that conference then spurs every 5 years another gathering of these Orthodox Gurneyite yearly meetings to consider their own life together. And by 1902, they form 5 years meeting of Friends, out of which Friends United Meeting and Western Yearly Meeting develop. So it all goes back to those revivals. Now, at the same time, there's another movement. Remember, last week we talked about in the 1700s, you had the Great Awakenings, but you also had the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, these competing movements. Same thing over against the revivals. You had the modern scientific movement, Darwin's Origin of the Species, evolution, the German higher criticism, the literary study of the Bible, treating the Bible like you would any other work of literature, and studying it as you would through editorial practice, through form criticism, editorial criticism, and embracing of modern science, which was often seen as in conflict with the Bible, especially evolution. Because if you question a 7-day creation in the Bible, then you can question anything else in the Bible. So you've got to reject evolution, because to accept it is to call into question the veracity of Holy Scripture. Now, it's interesting that at Earlham and at Guilford, because they had leadership in the form of Joseph Moore, one of those Quakers from Orange County, Indiana, went to a friend's boarding school, Earlham, and then got his master's at Harvard in biology, under the main opponent of Darwin's theory and the main proponent of Darwin's theory, and accepted a theistic understanding of evolution, and came back to Earlham to teach biology, as proclaimed by his faculty at Harvard as the best biologist west of the Appalachians. And because he was a recorded Friends minister and revered for his depth of spirituality, Quakers in Indiana said, okay, you can teach evolution at Earlham. So their science department wasn't destroyed as it was at so many denominational colleges. Now, Joseph Moore, after he retired as president at Earlham, went down to North Carolina to transform New Garden Boarding School into Guilford College. And there, along with some other progressive, liberal-minded Quakers like Mary Mendenhall Hobbs and Nereus Mendenhall, Lewis Linden Hobbs, did the same thing with the science department at Guilford. They accepted evolution, and it didn't rip things apart, because everyone revered Joseph Moore and Lewis Linden Hobbs and Nereus and Mary Mendenhall Hobbs. So it's interesting that even though evangelical Orthodox Gurneyite yearly meetings like Indiana and North Carolina could accept evolution in the late 1800s, because they respected the messengers who brought it. Now, again, this modernist scientific understanding of biology and of the Bible had its resonance with especially progressive friends like Lucretia Mott, who was famous for saying truth for authority, not authority for truth. And that had a profound impact on progressive friends, and increasingly the Hicksite friends who had maintained an understanding of the inward light, continuing revelation. The Bible's a secondary authority. And those movements of modernism and modern science led to the Manchester Conference in 1895 in England, as Quakers from the United States and England gathered to figure, okay, who are we? Much as the Richmond Declaration in 1887 was trying to figure out, how do we sort out all this evangelical revival influence? The 1895 Manchester Conference was trying to figure out, okay, how do we respond to modern science? And they embraced modern science. So after 1895, many friends were deeply influenced by that Manchester Conference, and an understanding that you can treat the Bible the way you treat any other work of literature. You can see Jesus as a mystical teacher, but you could also see that mystical teacher in Buddha or Muhammad or other great spiritual leaders throughout history, and an embrace of the modern world. So you've got that as background leading into the 1900s. So just as the movements in the 1700s laid the groundwork for the separations of the 1800s, the revival period and the evangelical holiness movements and represented by those revivals, and the modern science and German higher criticism of the scripture laid the foundation of what came in the 1900s. Now, by 1902, we've got two national organizations of Quakers growing out of those two separate branches. Out of the Richmond Declaration of Faith, you've got Friends United Meeting, formerly known as 5 Years Meeting, because they met every 5 years, formed in 1902 in Richmond. Friends General Conference grew out of Hicksite Sunday school conferences and annual gatherings at Cape May in New Jersey, and were also founded around 1900, 1902. Now, out of some of that movement, especially the evangelical movement, you have the development of Quaker missionary activity. Now, there have been some isolated Quaker missionary activity organized by individual Quakers, but not organizationally. Eli and Sybil Jones, evangelical revival preachers from Maine, went off to Palestine in 1868, met a young girl who wanted them to start a school in Ramallah, and asked a Quaker to start a school and step aside. They raised the funds. 1869, the Ramallah Friends School was established as a girls' school to teach girls under the Ottoman Turks. Some Orthodox friends in Philadelphia went to Japan, helped open up Japan to the Western world. And in 1902, very significantly, 3 evangelical holiness Quakers from Ohio, the Upper Graphite branch of Ohio Yearly Meeting, went to Kenya, East Africa, to find an area ripe for evangelism. And they found it in the western province of Kenya, where no other missionaries had set up any work. And eventually, under colonial British rule, the Brits figured, we don't want to deal with competing religious denominations here. We got enough trouble as it is, as colonial overlords. So Quakers, you can have the Western province. So essentially anyone in the Western province was going to be a Quaker. Catholics could have another province, Methodists had another province, and the Church of England had another province. So in 1902, the beginnings of African Quakerism began under those 3 evangelical holiness Quakers from Ohio. Then other yearly meetings began developing an interest in a missionary activity. Iowa Yearly Meeting developed some interest in Jamaica. Indiana Yearly Meeting and North Carolina Yearly Meeting developed an interest in Mexico. Oregon Yearly Meeting develops an interest in Central America. Central Yearly Meeting, that little separation up there in Westfield, develops an interest in Bolivia, where to this day, there are thousands of Central Yearly Meeting headquarters in Indiana, Bolivian Quakers. Now, as that is happening, these missionaries going out, there's a controversy in 5 Years Meeting about, okay, can we make sure that the missionaries we're sending out believe in our understanding of theology? So the more evangelical yearly meetings, Ohio, Kansas, Oregon, want 5 Years Meeting to require any missionaries going out on the field to essentially affirm the Richmond Declaration of Faith, so that they've got an orthodox theology. They've got essentially sign a creed. And this was one of the problems that many people had of the Richmond Declaration of Faith. It sounded like a creed, and it's been treated as a creed in the 1900s. But for some Quakers, that was just a bridge too far. We're not creedal. We can't require saying, okay, I accept the Richmond Declaration of Faith before they go out on the mission field. And so Kansas and Oregon left 5 Years Yearly Meeting over that in the 1920s. Rufus Jones tried to keep him in. Rufus Jones was clerk of 5 Years Meeting early on by adding the Richmond Declaration of Faith to the uniform discipline, faith and practice of 5 Years Meeting, but as other documents of 5 Years Meeting, not as a creedal statement. That wasn't good enough for Oregon, and Kansas. So they left. Eventually, they, along with Ohio, formed Evangelical Friends International, separate from Friends 5 Years Meeting and now Friends United Meeting. Now, while this is going on, there's another movement taking root, the fundamentalist movement. Now, the fundamentalist movement in the 1910s was an attempt to counter the modernism of the social gospel, modern science, evolution, the question about the ultimate authority of the Bible. And it was actually the fundamentalism developed out of a scholarly attempt, largely out of Chicago, by academics to nail down what are the fundamentals of Orthodox Christianity. And they got it down to the primary authority of the Scripture, inerrancy of Scripture, the substitutionary atonement, the final judgment, and so on. I think there were 5 fundamentals. You can kind of look them up. But it's essentially what we would recognize as evangelical theology: authority and inerrancy, infallibility of Scripture, the substitutionary atonement, Jesus' divinity, his virgin birth, his bodily resurrection, the final judgment, and eternal life. Well, this again takes root among those evangelical Quakers, deeply influenced by the revivals, who are aghast at modernism and the social gospel movement and the questions about the primacy of Scripture. And in Indiana, it took the form of an inquisition of the professors at Earlham College. Now, we have no seminaries at this time. You don't get a seminary in Quakerism until 1960, 100 years after we had our first pastors. We finally got around to educating them at a seminary. So the Bible departments of the Quaker colleges were where many of the preachers, if they got any education, were trained. And so the fundamentalists among Quakers were very skeptical about the Bible professors at places like Earlham and Guilford, where they had suspicion that they were influenced by modernism. And at Earlham, a committee was set up by fundamentalist pastors, essentially in an inquisition, to examine the professors at Earlham to see if they passed muster. And in the process, they ran out of the Bible department at Earlham Clarence Pickett, Alexander Purdy, and Elbert Russell. It did not ruin their lives. Clarence Pickett went on to be the long-serving chair of the American Friends Service Committee, the executive secretary of the American Friends Service Committee during its golden years. Alex Purdy went on to be the dean of the Hartford Seminary, Hartford Divinity School in Connecticut, educated generations of Quaker ministers. And Elbert Russell went off to be dean of Duke Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina, and helped found the Durham Friends Meeting. Alexander Purdy later on was a founding faculty member of Earlham School of Religion when it was established in 1960. And Elbert Russell was on the board of trustees at Guilford. So they were run out of town on a rail in Indiana yearly meeting, but went on to serve Friends quite well. Now, as powerful as this fundamentalist movement was, an event in the mid-1920s sent them underground, the Scopes monkey trial. When you had that trial of Clarence Darrow, I think it was Clarence Darrow, who was teaching evolution in a school in Tennessee, and I think it's William Jennings Bryan was the prosecutor in this trial. It was a national sensation, and it made the national press. And I think it was Minkin, kind of yellow journalist there at the Baltimore Sun, I think, who did a lot of reporting on this and created this caricature, this stereotype of the fundamentalists as just really backwards folk. And although Darrow was found guilty, the damage was done to fundamentalists by the stereotype that they were painted with. And they essentially went underground. And fundamentalists for decades in America, retreated from the public scene and emphasized, personal salvation. We can't get involved with politics. That's not what we're supposed to be about. We're supposed to be about, salvation. And, don't muddy your hands with all this politics and stuff like that. Well, you know where that went eventually, and we'll get around to that. Now, at the same time that all of this is happening, Quakers are developing organizations, some of them spanning both Gurneyite and Hicksite yearly meetings, Orthodox, Wilburite, Gurneyite. The American Friends Service Committee, for example, was founded in 1917 at Haverford College by what was his name? Rufus Jones. Rufus Jones was one of the founders. Henry Cadbury, another one, to provide alternative service for conscious objectors during World War I. The Friends World Committee for Consultation was formed essentially in the 1930s to provide a place where all the branches could come together in fellowship. And they held every 15-year conferences starting in 1937 and lasted well into recent times. They're still going. The Friends Committee on National Legislation was founded in 1943 as the first registered religious lobby in Washington, D.C. to promote Quaker understanding on Capitol Hill. And your own Indiana Friends Committee on Legislation grows out of that, an organization I think still active in Indiana to bring a Quaker voice to politics. Right Sharing of World Resources, which is having its annual board meeting in Richmond, Indiana this weekend, grew out of the 1% Fund movement in the 1960s, applying the Quaker testimony of simplicity to sharing the world's resources so that we can share our bounty, that if everyone lived a life of simplicity, there'd be plenty enough for everyone. It's not a lack of resources, it's a lack of will in sharing. And of course, controversy grew around every one of those. Also at the same time, you've got the decline in the early 1900s of the Quaker academies, the Quaker school system, as public schools developed. The first superintendent of public instruction in Indiana, in fact, was a Quaker, Barnabas Hobbs, who had been the head of the Bloomingdale Academy. And in many places, especially here in North Carolina, the public school systems just took over the Quaker schools when they developed in the 1880s. So you had a decline of those Quaker academies. Vermilion Academy, I think, was laid down in the 1920s, New London Academy in the 1920s. And at the same time, though, we have to be honest, we were establishing some other academies, Indian boarding schools. And I won't go into all the history of that, but there was an interesting development at Tunasasa, later on in New York, later on out in the Great Plains, when Quakers, both Orthodox and Hicksite Quakers, were given control of the Indian Bureau by President Grant. And they ran boarding schools out there with some of the same problems that we've seen in reevaluating those boarding schools, but not in Indiana and Ohio. Quakers who worked with the Indians in Ohio and Indiana merely responded to the request, I think we talked a couple weeks ago, of the Miami and the Shawnee and the Delaware and the Kickapoo to teach us agriculture, don't establish a boarding school, just teach us how to farm. And they did. So Ohio and Indiana Quakers avoided, the worst of the history of those Quaker boarding schools for Indians. Also established a school for Blacks in Arkansas called Southland Institute. And many Quakers from Indiana, including my great aunt Axa Carter from Bloomingdale, Indiana, and Mildred White and others from Indiana yearly meeting, taught in Southland. That school for Blacks lasted into the 1920s. But interestingly enough, when they developed a meeting of about 500 Black members of a Quaker meeting in Arkansas, based there at Southland Institute, and they applied for membership in Indiana Yearly Meeting, they were not accepted. And within years, that school disappeared, and the meeting disappeared. We won't get into the history of Daisy Douglas Barr, the most famous Quaker preacher of the 1920s and 30s there in Indiana, pastor at Newcastle and Muncie, who was at simultaneously the head cluckstress of the Women's Auxiliary of the KKK. You can look up Daisy Douglas Barr. Larry and I, who spent some of the best years of our lives in Muncie, Indiana, never heard of Daisy Douglas Barr when we were in Muncie, but she had a profound impact there in the 1920s and 30s. We also won't talk about the Quaker involvement in the famous lynchings in Marion, Indiana in 1929. So there's some history there that I hope you might explore at some point that we don't have time to go into tonight. So you finally have essentially no Quaker schools outside of the Northeast, where you still had all these private Quaker schools, but they pretty much disappeared in North Carolina and Indiana. And it's only much, much later in the 1900s that schools like the Richmond Friends School, down here, New Garden Friends School, High Point Friends School, Wilmington Friends School, Carolina Friends Schools developed. But you had strong colleges. You had Earlham, you had Wilmington in Ohio, Malone in Ohio, representing different branches, about 15 altogether. And they attracted a lot of attention from fundamentalists, especially, of are you teaching correct theology? Now, when the Earlham School of Religion was founded in 1960, it developed something quite interesting. Until 1960, there were many women ministers. I remember growing up in Western Yearly Meeting with people like Mary Hyatt and many other powerful women ministers. And after 1960 and establishment of Earlham School of Religion, that started declining for one specific reason. Again, you had the fundamentalists among Friends and the other evangelicals among Friends who were quite skeptical about what these women who were graduating from Earlham School of Religion were being taught. And it became very difficult for women to find positions as pastors in pastoral meetings throughout Indiana, Iowa, North Carolina, elsewhere, where they were accepted before 1960 because they weren't seminary educated. After 1960, many of the women were seminary educated, and that called them into question. And so that's an interesting development. There's a question here about, please tell us more about the Quaker involvement in Grant County lynchings. I can't go too deep into it, but one of the people involved was a Quaker. But of course, there were thousands involved, but there were Quakers involved. But one of the Quakers who tried to one of the people who tried to stand in the breach, a fire chief, was a Quaker, but he couldn't do anything in front of upwards of 10,000 people who wanted to hang these two young men. When one Quaker pastor, after the lynchings, called on Indiana Yearly Meeting to write a minute condemning these lynchings, he couldn't get it past the yearly meeting because too many pastors knew that they had people in their meetings who had supported the lynchings. And so it simply came out as a statement against violence and mob rule, but didn't condemn the lynching. So it's a rather sad saga in our history, but there were Quakers on both sides. So anyway, you've got all this as background now. The modernist fundamentalist issues, the revivals, the modern science, and this is all percolating. And then the 1960s hit. And the 1960s become this hinge in not only American history, but Quaker history. because several things happened in the 1960s that brought the fundamentalists and other evangelicals out of the woodwork, out of hiding since the Scopes monkey trial. Because with the Supreme Court ruling about prayer in public school, they saw, God has been taken out of the classroom. The God is dead movement, 1965. This all frightened folk. What's happening to our society? God's being called into questions. God's been taken out of our classrooms. So a question of, it's an assault on faith. It's assault on Christianity that we know. Then you have Stonewall. You have the gay liberation movement. And you have this growing concern about homosexuality, about the family. And we all know the conversation around that because it's still going on. And then the anti-war movement, opposition to government policy. The government has lied to us, and all of that, calling into question, the devotion to the flag, to patriotism, to the country, is known as the 3 F's: flag, family, and faith. And certain political operators used this as an opportunity to solidify their own political movements. And you see the rise of the Moral Majority, Christian Coalition, Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie, take these social issues and use them, some might say cynically, to get evangelical and fundamentalist Christians on board with their political agenda. And then you see the rise of some of these powerful preachers like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, and they're having an impact on the Quakers, who are fundamentalist, evangelical, and you're beginning to see the growing split. Before the 1950s and 60s, we didn't talk about a lot of these issues. The focus was on personal salvation, getting right with God. Then it got political in the 60s and 70s. And that came at the same time, at least there in Indiana. I'm going to focus on Indiana for a moment, when the economy was changing. I remember we were farmers up in Roosevelt, dairy farmers. About everybody had an 80 to 160 acre farm. If you had several hundred acres, you were a rich farmer. But most of us had small farms, 2 bottom, 3 bottom plows, and rotated our crops. You had a herd of about 20 cows. You had some hogs, you had some chickens. And what that meant was you had lots of farm families, 80 and 160 acre farms, lots of farm families with large families. You had to have a lot of children to work the farm. And that was a funnel into the local Friends Church or Friends meeting. Roosevelt, where I grew up, anytime you opened the doors, you had 150 people at meeting for worship. And social life revolved around the meeting. We were there for Sunday school and church in the morning, youth activities in the afternoon, and church on Sunday night. Then you had youth activities, midweek prayer meeting, Bible study through the week. Then you had big quarterly meetings and monthly meetings, and it packed the place out. By the end of the 1960s, and I remember my brother, Gene, going off for his associate's degree at Purdue and hearing Dean Earl Butts tell them, boys, and it was all boys at that time, you can't farm like your parents and your grandparents did. You've got to go big. Borrow as much money as you can, buy as much land as you can. You got to go big. And that's what they did into the 60s, early 70s. And within about a decade, and many of you can remember watching this happen, you went from small farms, 80 to 160 acres, to now what you've got there's 1,000-acre farms, thousands of acres. And where Roosevelt meeting was populated by the children and parents and grandchildren of all these farms populating the meeting. All of a sudden, all of those little farms are coalesced into 2 farms, that my cousin's farm of several thousand acres. And you went in a decade from about 150 average attendance to about 30. And you've seen this happen all over Indiana. I was just amazed to read this week that West Newton is selling their property. 60 years ago, when that meeting house was built, it was state of the art. It was packed. But again, there's a farming economy around it. There's not a farming economy around West Newton anymore. And the same thing has happened in lots and lots of meetings around Indiana. Now, what happens is, over the decades, when there was nothing you had to do to guarantee a population of your meeting, you didn't have to advertise. You just had a natural funnel of kids coming into your meeting. So you didn't have to figure out how to advertise who you were, how to draw the distinction between you and the Methodists and the Baptists and the Christians down the road. And so over the years, you begin to forget your distinctives. And then the revival movements and the evangelical and fundamentalist theology comes in, and pretty soon you really don't look that much different from anyone else. And then the economy changes, and you don't have that natural funnel anymore. And what do? Suddenly, you've gone from 150 to 30, and you can't afford a full-time pastor anymore. And you look at the big mega churches down the road, or the Baptists who have big screen TVs and praise bands, and well, maybe if we do that. And so you start copying what other people do much better, and you can't compete, and you've lost your distinctives. And then you get desperate. And again, I'm oversimplifying, but you got to lay the blame somewhere. And you're not going to blame yourself. You're going to blame, well, I think it's those folk, or it's that school, or it's ESR, or it's whatever these other movements are. And that laid the groundwork for what we've seen recently, the splits. And in the chat, I listed 3 books that help understand the recent splits there in Indiana and here in North Carolina. I mentioned Phil Gully's The Transformation of American Quakerism, but the other 2 are Stephen Angel, a professor at Earlham School of Religion, and his excellent analysis of the dissolution of Indiana Yearly Meeting, or the split in Indiana Yearly Meeting between Indiana Yearly Meeting and the new association. The book called Indiana Trainwreck. And then a few years after that, same thing happened in North Carolina. And you all know the issues, at least most of you from Indiana know that it was, again, those issues of homosexuality, the authority of scripture, same-sex marriage, and these social issues that have various roots. Some of it in the 60s, and watching the culture change and the fear that comes out of that, but also an understanding of the Bible, going back to the Bible's primary authority, ultimate authority, rooted in the Orthodox Gurneyite 5 Years Meeting, Friends United Meeting, branch of Friends, and the Richmond Declaration of Faith, that there can be no appeal to any other authority other than Scripture. And so when more progressive or liberal friends say, Quakers believe in continuing revelation, and modern science and our understanding of psychology, and Masters and Johnson down there at IU have taught us something differently about homosexuality. Fundamentalists and evangelicals are saying, but the Bible says, and again, they've rejected modern form criticism of the Bible to German scholarship, because that calls into question the inerrancy, infallibility of the Bible. So the Richmond Declaration of Faith begins to be applied to these controversies. But the Richmond Declaration of Faith says the Bible is our authority. And so you get debates over continuing revelation. And here in North Carolina, when friends said, yeah, we revere the Bible, we study the Bible, we find great strength in the Bible, but Quakers believe in continuing revelation. And modern science and psychology and our own experience have led us to a different understanding of homosexuality than the Bible has traditionally been interpreted to say. And the argument against that is we don't believe in continuing revelation. You know, that is rejected in the Richmond Declaration of Faith. And so there can be no appeal to Quaker precedents because the Bible takes precedence. And the arguments broke out. And again, I can't go into all of it, but many of you have lived through this. And you know that it wasn't just homosexuality, it was also New Age thinking. And again, loosely defined, anything, at least here in North Carolina, we ask people to define what's New Age. And they say, well, anything that's not Christian. So, there goes the Bhagavad Gita, there goes the Quran, there goes any spiritual writings that aren't Christian. And there at Fairfield, you know that you have one person in the meeting became a lightning rod for much of this. And you not only had splits in the yearly meeting, you had inquisitions, and you had meetings that left, became independent. And in Indiana, you had the split. And here in North Carolina, they simply dissolved the yearly meeting because they couldn't agree on a lot of these social issues. And so this 319-year-old institution of North Carolina yearly meeting that we're celebrating 350 years this year in North Carolina of Quaker community, 4 years ago, that institution dissolved. And out of it grew the Friends Church of North Carolina, an evangelical association, and the North Carolina Fellowship of Friends, which has a congregational polity that has rejected the authority of top-down people telling you what to believe in creedalism. So anyway, that's where we are today. Those two books that I mentioned, Indiana Trainwreck and Murder at Quaker Lake, cover the issues in Indiana and here in North Carolina. But again, many of you have lived through this there, and I want to leave the last 15 minutes or so for your own response and response to some of the questions in the chat. But just to give some sense now, them splits aren't just in Indiana and North Carolina. Wilmington yearly meeting has split. Oregon Northwest yearly meeting split into Northwest yearly meeting and Cascades. Several other yearly meetings have had meetings leave, go independent, have had these same sorts of arguments. And in the course of all this, of trying to maintain the true faith that many thought they could maintain by driving out the liberals or the progressives or those who didn't practice Quakerism the way they thought. There in Western, they drove out North Meadow Circle of Friends, West Lafayette, Bloomington, who went off to other associations. You did not witness growth. Western yearly meeting now, I think, is down to fewer than 2,000 from around when I was growing up 60 years ago, probably 12 to 13,000. Indiana yearly meeting went from about 15,000, not that many years ago, to they're under 2,000. North Carolina yearly meeting, the two associations put together are no more than 3,000. Now, again, this is an American issue. Quakerism has declined in Europe as well, has declined in England, but where is it growing? By leaps and bounds. I hope you got the report from John Muhanji by email. Half the world's Quakers are in Kenya, East Africa. And the numbers there, it's hard to tell, again, because if you're in the Western province, essentially you're Quaker, although Kenyan missionaries themselves have taken the word out and established other missions, but they're growing and growing into Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, Botswana. And I hope you do get that report from John Mohanji, who talks about how they have shaken off the colonial Quakerism that they inherited from those 1902 missionaries and developed their own cultural Quaker. It doesn't look anything like American Quakerism, but they do have a very strong peace testimony, and they are growing, as is Quakerism in Central and South America. Now, what do we have in common then? Is there anything that holds Quakers together with all these splintering and all the different understandings of social and theological, political, cultural issues? We're blue Quakers and red Quakers, and that's essentially one of the major problems. It's not only theological, it's political. And it's rural and urban, much like the Hicksite Orthodox separation. And I really don't have an answer to that. The one thing that I've heard some people agree on that Quakers do have in common across all these divides is that our worship is still rather informal. We don't follow a liturgy typically. We don't recite the Apostles' Creed. We don't have the kind of liturgical worship that Methodists and Presbyterians and Episcopalians have. Now that's changing in some places, but essentially that's about all we have in common. We don't have a common peace testimony. We don't have a common understanding of that of God or the inward light. We certainly don't have a common understanding of equality or even integrity or simplicity. Now in England, I'll end on this, and then I see several hands up and other comments. In England, they have the same sort of question, although they've all remained unprogrammed. They don't have pastors in England, but there's a lot of diversity of theology and practice. And the joke was once said by Ben Pink Dandelion, a great Quaker sociologist over there, that in England, Quakers can believe anything about theology, about the Bible, about the person and work of Christ, and you're okay. But the one thing that Quakers have in common is they all recycle their envelopes. Now, I was at Woodbrook, the Quaker Study Center in Birmingham, once back 20 years ago, and someone mentioned that. And Ben Pink Dandelion was present. He said, I don't think I ever really said that. I said, no, Ben, I think you really did. I said, well, I don't know. I don't know if I really articulated it that way. That day, a registration for a conference at Pendle Hill at the Woodbrook came in with their registration check and their registration form and an envelope in 1999 that had been saved since 1962. Anyway, let me end there. And I see Carter has his hand up, and then Franklin has his hand up. Yeah, Carter?
Couple of things. One, you say, the inerrancy of the Bible. The Bible is the final authority. My question has always been, is the Bible complete? And that's part of continuing revelation. Are there books of the Bible that we're missing that aren't part of canon, as they call it, that aren't used? So that can also complicate things. Can another book be found and add it to canon, or do we use what the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church developed as a canon years ago, centuries ago? So that to me is an issue. And as you say, Quakers are all over the place.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways that is good if we can just have a baseline between us.
Yeah, thank you. And indeed, and Robert Barclay, in fact, in his apology, said that he held it open that future books of the Bible could be added to the Bible. because of continuing revelation. I want to acknowledge Ron and Pam Ferguson. I often overstate the case, and I was kind of jokingly saying that 1898 Winchester Friends Church almost looked like it had gargoyles. It doesn't, but as they say, it does have 20 kilowatts of solar power on the roof. Thanks for that correction. But it is a little different in architecture from some of the earlier Quaker meeting houses. Let's see, Franklin, you had your hands up.
Hi, Max, and everyone. Yeah, I'm talking about the recent split in North Carolina yearly meeting. Even within Friends Church of North Carolina, we're not monolithic by any means, and it's really apparent when you have larger gatherings and whatnot. And we at Random and Friends meeting tend to be on the, I would say, more pastoral than evangelical. And so sometimes we're probably considered a fringe element of Friends Church of North Carolina. So because we're not hardcore on the Bible as final authority. We're not hardcore on, sexual identity and things of that nature. And but some in Friends Church of North Carolina very much are. And we even see procedure in like mid-year gathering and annual sessions and things like that make me think, am I at a Baptist or a Methodist convention here? So I just wanted to put that out there to let folks know that I've seen a lot of changes in the 20 years or so that I've been associated with Quakers, and particularly in the last 7 or 8. Personally, not real happy about it. I think we could do a little better about finding our commonalities and using them to grow. But I certainly don't have all the answers.
One of the hopeful signs, and one of the questions earlier on in the chat was, does anyone see any reconciliation of these splits coming down the road? November 5th, there's going to be a gathering at Quaker Lake, which is the kind of summer camp for North Carolina, like Quaker Haven is for Western Indiana yearly meetings. For folk from both any of the associations, we've got Southern Appalachian Yearly Meeting Association, we've got Piedmont Friends Yearly Meeting, we've got Friends Church of North Carolina, we've got the North Carolina Fellowship of Friends, we've got North Carolina Yearly Meeting Conservative, we have Evangelical Friends as Eastern Region. So we have several associations of friends here, and all are welcome to this gathering on November 5th, just for fun and fellowship, because folk have realized, especially in the Friends Church of North Carolina and the North Carolina Fellowship of Friends, since the dissolution 4 or 5 years ago, we miss each other. We don't necessarily agree with each other, but we had friendships across these lines, and we miss those folk. And so there's some efforts at finding opportunities to have occasions where we can get together without haggling about old theological differences. And at least the United Society of Friends Women, Quaker Men, and the Friends Disaster Service have maintained openness to friends from all branches, and they don't check your theology at the door before you come to their meetings. So, yeah, every split reveals an intolerance for different perspectives. Certainly true. I mean, this was one of the revelatory moments in the run up to this dissolution of North Carolina Yearly Meeting 4 years ago, was when a speaker at one of the sessions who'd been asked to talk about Quaker peacemaking, in the hopes that some of the understandings of Quaker peacemaking elsewhere could be applied to peacemaking within the Society of Friends, ended his talk by saying one of the major impetuses for friends who are involved in peace work is a recognition that we're all children of God. And the next day, one of the pastors leading the drum beat for a separation, who'd come into his Quaker meeting as pastor from a fundamentalist Baptist background and did not agree with most of Quaker theology, stood up and said, last night we heard false doctrine. We are not all children of God. I mean, a rejection of the belief of the light in everyone, which has been rejected in some branches of Friends, that notion of the inward light. And he got essentially a standing ovation. That again, a very narrow understanding of who's a child of God. Only those who have accepted Christ as personal Lord and Savior is a child of God. So that highlighted quite a bit of difference in our yearly meeting.
Max, I have a question.
Okay.
Is it accurate to say that no evangelist who visited America during the mid-season of Quakerism really did us any favors?
Yeah, I think that's fair. When Thomas Shillito came, or Stephen Grellett, John Gurney, they just fanned the flames of the differences. And as Alan Jay said about the separations when he wrote his autobiography, not a single separation has ever added a single person to the kingdom of God or caused others to say, behold how these Christians love one another.
Well, that's what amazes me is that, that it was like they were introducing a pox to American Quakerism, while Quakerism in Britain was largely absent of these splits, wasn't it?
Yeah. They exported their evangelical missionary. They all came out of England, it seemed. Yeah, Shillito, Gurney, Braithwaite. The person who wrote the Richmond Declaration of Faith was William Braithwaite, a British Quaker whose yearly meeting wasn't even invited to the conference. But he was an evangelical, Orthodox. Most of his family had already gone off to the Pilgrim Holiness Church. But he was holding on, and he came to the 1887 Richmond conference with the declaration already written and presented it, and it was accepted, except by Ohio Quakers because they wanted sacraments in there. So Updegraff was not pleased. But the thing that still amazes me is that Alan Jay, again, who was evangelical but moderate, he was what Tom Ham called a renewal friend, not a fundamentalist. He deeply admired Braithwaite, hosted Braithwaite in his home in Richmond, and Braithwaite gave Alan Jay the pen he wrote the Richmond Declaration with. And Alan Jay treasured that to the end of his days. But one of his closest friends was Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, the wife of the first president Guilford, who hated the Richmond Declaration of Faith because she said it's a creed, and Quakers are not creedal. This thing will be used as a creed down the road, and she was right. But Alan Jay and Mary Mendenhall Hobbs could be very good friends, disagree, and that's something we don't see as much these days, unfortunately.
Max, I see
Yeah.
Debbie Heaton has had her hand
Okay,
up
Debbie, yeah.
recently, so
Yeah.
let's let her.
Okay, Debbie.
What I just wondered is, do you know much about the Blue River Friends that are down in Washington?
Yeah.
My family was the Callaways, and they married into the Coffins, and they were down there. And then of course, when they came up here, there was no Quaker meetings. But
Yeah.
I don't know much history about that meeting house.
There are two meeting houses down there. The old plain meeting house was the Hicksite meeting house. The Orthodox Gurney went just up the road and built what looks like a church, and they survived. They went pastoral. I think they still are, I don't know, they may still be members of Western Yearly Meeting.
Yes, they are.
but
And Chris Lindley is their pastor.
Who is?
Chris Lindley. who
Okay.
also pastors Newberry Friends Meeting in Paoli.
Okay, there's still Lindleys down there. That's where they settled from North Carolina.
He is a direct descendant of the original Lindley.
Jonathan Lindley, whose farm is where University of North Carolina is now, before he left for Indiana. But yeah, the Hicksite meeting then declined, as most Hicksite meetings did in Indiana, because they didn't embrace the revival movement. And so down they went. But those meeting houses are still there, and they have, I think, an annual gathering at the old Hicksite meeting house that's being restored. Yeah. Okay, we've hit 8:30. If there are other questions, I'm happy to entertain them. I know this is a very confusing march through the 20th and 21st centuries, but I personally am convinced that one of the major issues in Indiana was the change in the economy. I think if the agricultural economy hadn't changed the way it had, so suddenly they may have had time there to think through some of this, but it happened so suddenly. Yeah. Ann Tiller has her hand up.
Hi there. I'm kind of a rogue in this group because I was raised as a Southern Baptist, and I went to the Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville for the short while that it was acceptable to have women in that institution. And I'm at the point now where I'm looking for the least creedal denomination, religion, whatever you want to call it. So who is the least creedal of the Quakers at this stage of the game?
Well, again, FGC to a certain extent, but as some Quakers will joke, like Ben Pink Dandelion did of British Friends, you can believe anything you want to. There's no creed there, but you better recycle your envelopes. In Western Yearly Meeting, I think it'd be, you know, each congregation can make its own decision. You better not bring the wrong thing to the potluck.
Right.
I mean, each group has its own kind of part of the boundaries, but I think pretty much you've got to look at each individual meeting.
Right.
I think take a look at their websites and like at Fairfield.
I'm actually in Richmond, Virginia now.
Okay, that meeting is non-creedal.
Yes, I've actually been there several years ago for a couple of times at invitation, but I'm just hunting around more seriously at this stage. So it's good to hear that.
Yeah. Well,
And that's, this emphasis on creedalism is still very strong. When I was having all my trouble in the yearly meeting, we went to an administrative session in Ridge Farm monthly meeting, where a man stood up and said, as far as I'm concerned, if a Quaker minister can't stand up and repeat the Nicene Creed, he has no business being a pastor.
yeah.
And I'm thinking, seriously, the Nicene Creed?
Yeah.
How did we get there?
Yeah. Yeah, you pretty much have to look at each individual meeting. Yeah. And then even within there, you have certain rituals within meetings that you'd better not violate. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Warren and Andrea have their hand up.
Max, can I say one more thing before?
Yeah.
I just want to thank you for the context that you have given me for not only Quaker religious history, but Southern Baptist and Presbyterian. And over the decades, I've seen each one go through these different stages, and you've given me a better context than anyone else has. So thank you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, Warren and Andrea?
I could second that. I came to Quakerism by way of Unitarianism in Jacksonville, Florida. My first contact with Quakers, they came to our liberal religious youth group in the mid-1960s. So there's a whole history of this social activism and involvement in the communities and the relationship with these FGC type meetings in the South, many of which are much more recent. Miami meeting didn't build its meeting house till 1960, for instance. So I've been making some notes and thinking about this. There were Quaker work camps in New England. I'm not sure what years, but I met Quakers who met other people or went to these work camps and then became Quakers. And that was in the like 1950s, I think. And so the Quaker work camp movement is a way to bring people to Quakerism. And I don't know, did that benefit mostly FGC type meetings, or were the FUN type meetings also involved in the work camps?
There, yeah, I'd mentioned AFSC, starting in 1970. They sponsored a lot of these work camps. They were very popular, brought a lot of people into Quakerism, and they finally laid them down for a variety of reasons. For one, it was getting harder and harder to recruit people to them. They were having issues with the young people.
Yeah.
But they attracted folk from across the branches. And Friends United Meeting, and this is appropriate to some of the social issues we've talked about, when Frank Massey, who was executive secretary later on of Baltimore Yearly Meeting, about 17 and a half years, a yearly meeting is growing. Over the last 20, 30 years, it has grown, not only in numbers of meetings, but in population as an unprogrammed liberal yearly meeting. When he was on staff at Friends United Meeting in the 1980s, he started a Quaker voluntary service program. Had a unit in Cincinnati. I think he had a unit in Indianapolis, and it was very successful. But some in Friends United Meeting asked, are you making sure that the volunteers who go there are not homosexuals? And Frank was unwilling to have a litmus test or to have a statement on the application for this voluntary program, are you gay or lesbian? And they had to lay the whole program down. Now it's been replaced.
There is a Quaker voluntary service still.
There's now. And it's one of our graduates at Guilford College, Christina Repoli, one of our Quaker leadership scholars, began it and learned a lot from Frank about what worked, what didn't work in that one. And they do not have a litmus test. Anyone can be in QVS, but that was one of the things that has unfortunately laid down some of those work camps that had been such a vital part. Yeah. I see Stephen Taylor has his hand up.
Hi, Max.
Hey, Stephen.
Gosh, what can I say? I've learned a lot more about you and about myself in the past 5 weeks than I have in the 20, 25 years we've known each other. So just thank you very much. And thanks for being a part of the Guilford community these many years.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that.
And I know where to find you for further discussion.
Yes, you do. Yeah, Steve's a 75 graduate of Guilford. He's a young pup. He's a young whippersnapper. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Again, I apologize for oversimplifying all of this. I've left a lot out. There's a lot more nuance to this than my presentation, but do look at some of those books and email me with corrections, further questions. I'm kind of sorry to draw this series to an end. I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot from you, and be holding Jane and me in the light. The day after tomorrow, we leave for Palestine, and we'll be over there for a couple of weeks picking olives and attending board meetings of the Ramallah Friends School and trying to make sense of the current situation. One of the Ramallah Friends School students was just arrested in the middle of the night 2 nights ago, beaten bloody and hauled out to prison, still in detention, and it's causing quite a bit of concern in the Quaker community, the Friends School community there in Ramallah. So hold it all in the light.
Max, we can't thank you enough for giving so generously of your time and experience, sharing with us all that you know. And I suspect it's not even all you know. It's scratching the surface.
What I don't know, I make up, and you just have to figure out the difference.
Do I speak for all friends present, which I know is always a danger to attempt, but do I speak for all friends present when I suggest that we do this again in 3 years?
If I'm
all right.
Maybe with someone else teaching it, but I've enjoyed it. I see another hand up if you have time.
I wanted to ask you a question about Guilford back in 1975. When you were, I knew somebody that taught English there. Her name was Lucy Wellens. Did you ever know Lucy Wellens back in the 1975, 76?
That'd be you, Steve.
Huh?
Did you know Lucy Wellens?
No, I didn't in 75.
She taught English at Guilford.
Yeah. In 75, the English department included Beth Kaiser, though, and Mel and Beth are kind of at Guilford historic and revered Quakers and retired faculty members. And Mel was a very, very influential member of the religion department. But I don't remember Lucy Wellens. Sorry.
Well, Phil, thank you. Thank you, Fairfield Friends, for hosting this. Thank you, Larry, I think, for reeling me into this. It at least gave me an opportunity to see my old buddy from Ball State again. And
Larry's just the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah. Thank you all. I'll miss seeing you, but we'll be picking olives this time next week.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks,
Thank
Max.
you all.
Be careful.
All right.
Good luck with those olives.
Thanks. Will do. I don't think they have pimentos in them when they grow on the trees. Well, I'll see.
You know, at Fairfield, the only olives I see are the ones in martinis.
Yeah. Those are the wet Quakers. I'm one of those dry Quakers. Thanks again, everyone.
Bye, Max. Thanks a lot.
Larry.
Learned an awful lot. Thank you.
What are we going to do next Thursday night? What are we going to do next Thursday night?
I think Larry's going to take over the session and
Okay.
tell all the stories of Whitcraft's third floor hall.
Yes.
Oh, boy. That would be good.
And we also know that no one is going to be at Max's house next Thursday night, so let's just assemble there.
Except our dog sitter.
I think we
Actually,
should just drop
I thought
out.
we were having Max from Ramallah.
We're in Tallahassee, so we're a little bit farther away.
All right.
And
Thank
I
you
was
all.
hoping this
Take
would
care.
restart as soon as he got back from Ramallah.
Max, I was late coming on. Did Haven Kimmel do a good job introducing you?
She did. She's such a sweet, and I hope we sold some of her books.
If you haven't read A Girl Named Skippy, you must.
Zippy,
It is
yeah.
one of the finest coming of age books I've ever read.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
Yes.
Right up there with these Phil Gully books.
She's better. She's a writer's writer.
Yeah. All righty. Thank you all. Take care.
Take care.
Max.
Bye,
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.